Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of When Movies Were Good. We're here recording from the Resort Studios, aka my flat, here in Melbourne, Australia. I'm Rachel, of course, and I'm recording with my special guest star, the one and only Matt.
Hello, Rachel. Good to see you again.
Good to see you. Matt and I have been through the ups and downs of illness and travelling and a few other things, so we haven't had a chance to record for a little while, but we're back on track.
Well, you've been ill. I've been on holiday.
Yeah, that's true. Matt was visiting the great state of South Australia in Adelaide. How was your trip?
Excellent. They have a lovely selection of fresh meat and sausages there.
They do, yeah, you went to the German part, isn't it?
Yeah, Handorf, like the little Germany. So lots of great sausage and salami distributors.
Is
there.
that actually in the city of Adelaide, or?
No, it's like sort of half an hour drive from there.
Okay, yeah, I had a friend that went there as well, and she said it was great, but she has a European background as well. Well, that's quite fitting because this week's episode is linked by European royalty, I guess you could say, English and French, and also in light of the many issues in the current royal family of the UK. Matt and I thought we'd do a royal-themed one.
Yeah, well, kind of the biggest influence was kind of a half commemoration to the death of Prince Philip. Although,
that's right.
Like, it does feel a bit strange to be saying that now, because when we were planning the episode, that was when all his commendations were coming in.
Yeah.
But obviously, we only record a couple of weeks at a time, and then one of us got sick, the other was on holidays, so it's kind of like VIII Prince Philip, just slightly late.
Yeah, yes, definitely VIII to Prince Philip. So we are discussing... I don't know technically if she is directly related to this monarch, but I don't think so, because there was a lot of abdications and other people coming in from other houses and things like that. So we're discussing, the two films we're discussing tonight are both from the 1930s, The Private Life of Henry VIII, which is actually a British film, not a Hollywood film. And then we had Marie Antoinette, 1938, which is a Hollywood production starring Norma Shearer. So these were two interesting films, sort of enjoyable watches, a bit of artistic license, we would say.
Yeah, it's because I'm such a historical fanatic, I kind of have to often suppress a lot of my historian's rage when I see historical films, and be like, okay, I respect the creative choice here, but like... with every other historical film, it's always kind of done with a bit of judgment of the politics of whoever's writing it, and you kind of always have to bear that in mind when looking at a subject.
Yeah, and so we'll start with The Private Life of Henry VIII. So it's a 1933 British film, and directed by Alexander Korda, starring the great Charles Laughton. I've seen Charles Laughton in a few other things, so it was good to see him here. Robert Donat, Merle Oberon, and Elsa Lancaster, who was Charles Laughton's wife, and she also was the bride of Frankenstein. The name sounded familiar, and I thought, hang on, she's actually the lady that played the bride of Frankenstein.
I'm not sure she'd have been thrilled with the title.
Maybe back then it had a different connotation, but now it's literally, she's the bride of Frankenstein. So this film focuses on, it's a look at the marriages of King Henry VIII, but it starts technically with Anne Boleyn, so his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, is sort of mentioned at the start, but not really focused on. And it was a major international success at the time, and the director, Alexander Korda, was a leading filmmaker, and then Charles Laughton really got into being a box office star, at least over there. So what were your thoughts on this one?
I really enjoyed it, and it was kind of a guilty enjoyment, because you do realise that we're talking about the rather unfair execution of quite a few people going along the way, and but you have all this black humour going along, and even my favourite part was when he was with his what was it, his fourth wife? Was it Anne of Cleves, or the one that he only saw by a picture first, and was like
yes, Anne of Cleves.
Yeah, and like he was like. They were playing cards on their wedding night, and he sort of like lost all these bets, and he was like, "Does anybody have any money?" Like I haven't laughed that hard in a scene in a film for a while.
Yeah, Yeah, actually, I thought, I understand that they, from reading some of the historical narratives and then seeing some analysis of the film where they said, well, this didn't happen, that didn't happen, all the rest of it. But I think what they were trying to do is make people relate to Henry VIII. So they sort of cast some of the wives more in sort of villainous roles rather than, well, I guess, I don't know if he was the true villain. I mean, he was very much a product of the time and a product of his upbringing. But as you said, a lot of the things that he did, like creating the Church of England and stuff and breaking away from Catholicism so he could marry Anne Boleyn, for example, were sort of kind of a waste of time because he didn't really ever get what he wanted anyway.
Well, the fact that the whole breaking off from Rome, because Henry VIII actually would have... in any other situation, he'd have been on the opposite side. He was quite a conservative person, religious-wise, but he sort of allowed these ideas from, I think it was directly related to Martin Luther's ideas, that he could break off with the right as a secular ruler to give himself the justification to get a divorce without the Pope's permission. But the fact that, because at that time there was no historical or minimal historical precedent for a female ruler, and so he was desperate to have a son, because I think at that time he'd only had the one daughter, Mary.
Yes, that's right, with his first wife, yeah.
But, like, within a living memory for many people, they still ended up with Elizabeth I on the throne, so it's kind of like all that strife for absolutely nothing, and, like, it's easy to get caught up in the political turmoil and the linkage to international conflicts, but also not forgetting that, like, and this is something that I think people take for granted if they aren't regular churchgoers, especially in the way people approach religion now, but in very pious times, it would have been psychological torment for a lot of citizens to suddenly be told they're excommunicated, recommunicated and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So, to make the film entertaining and I guess for the audience to go along with it, they've had to take a bit of artistic license. So, for example, like Anne Boleyn was portrayed as like a noble victim who behaves with dignity, but they didn't actually, go through why she was, executed, because that she was on a trumped up charge of incest with her brother, and
half the reason I think is just because the reasons for the execution were so stupid.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Just to give him, it was just a pretext to get rid of her. And, there's a few things like they kind of jump ahead a little bit with Jane Seymour comes in and he marries her on the same day, and that didn't quite happen in the history. Also, the whole thing with, Anne of Cleves being in love with another man, I don't believe that was true at all, because, there was that little side relationship she was having. There always
has to be a side relationship.
There always has to be a side relationship. So I think it was trying to make Henry seem a bit more, I don't know, so the audience could relate to him, and because obviously he's the central character of the piece, but he was really known as a tyrant. And I guess Charles Laughton's portrayal of him was the first time an audience would have seen him portrayed on the screen. And I think Charles Laughton did a pretty good job. I mean, he was a portly, over-the-top sort of character.
Yeah. Henry VIII actually wasn't apparently as big as he's often made out in portraits. Like, he'd wear the heavy padding just so he could, because of the drafty castles he lived in.
Yeah.
Eventually he did become quite large. I think they needed pulleys to help him to bed, although I think partially he had, ulcers in the leg or something. Yeah,
it just said that... it was saying here in a history book that I was reading that in the 1540s he became very corpulent, that's a great word, and very prematurely aged. And like you said, he had to be moved around, I guess, I don't know if they had wheelchairs back then, but in that sort of pulley system where they had to... Yeah, so it was kind of a sad, undignified ending for a great character, but I did enjoy Charles Laughton's portrayal. I thought he was pretty much perfect for the role, really.
Yeah, it was kind of a sort of musical, historical comedy type style, which is very typical of the era, and I enjoyed it greatly, although in this kind of Me Too age, it's you can't imagine, you can sort of sympathise with the storytelling of the time, but you can't imagine a film being made these days that would treat so lightly someone who was so... dismissive of his spouses.
I know, and really in both films as well, it just was a period, a part of that time in history that people were so disposable, not only from natural illnesses, like how many people lost young children to tuberculosis and all sorts of things, but just he wanted to get rid of someone, so a trumped up charge was made and they got their head cut off, and it was just on to the next person.
And what's scary is that by standards of rulers at the time, Henry still had a relatively held back political system compared to the likes of France and places. He didn't have absolute rule of purse strings, which was often a big thing.
Yeah, that's right. Although when he did create the Church of England, did that mean that a lot of the property of those Catholic sort of churches reverted to him? I think I was reading that somewhere that increased his wealth. He
managed to take on a considerable wealth, although apparently, because he was massive into increasing military expenditure, because he wanted to be he was within just out of living memory of the great military victories in the 100 Years' War against France. He wanted to really follow in those glories, and war is expensive, and so he wanted to take in all that cash to help. So he was constantly on financial ruin.
Yeah,
he's known for playing a great part in expanding the English Navy.
Yes, that's true, yeah. And I guess, his original first marriage to Catherine of Aragon, she was part of the Spanish royal family.
Yes.
So that was sort of to solidify that. And then Anne of Cleves was part of a German royal family of the Cleves. Yeah. So a lot of people got married back then, as we'll see in the next sort of story about that the monarch in France. People married for everything but love, sort of,
If you did love the person, it was an optional extra.
It was, yeah. I mean, if you did actually manage to fall in love with the person, then... But I believe it was...
People still get married for money and stuff.
Yeah, that's very true. I like the film, and I think it was really because I like Charles Laughton so much. Now, what's Charles Laughton? Is it Hunchback of Notre Dame? Is that one of his other films that he's well known for?
Maybe. It was a real guilt pleasure film for me because I was enjoying the humour and frivolity they were making of what was really quite a tragic historic period.
Yeah, it really was, and the way he went through those wives as well. And then, he still ended up kind of alone, really, at the end, even though he was married to his last wife. She sort of was able to sort of stay with him for that period of time. But as I was joking to Matt before we started recording, what planet have I been living on? I just barely realised that Elizabeth I was his daughter and the third monarch of his line to get to the throne.
Well, yeah, I think he had 3 legitimate children.
Yes.
I think he had at least 1 illegitimate son, and I think he yes, to be illegitimate was awkward, but if you were from a rich and powerful enough parent, it didn't necessarily mean you were without discomfort. Yeah. But of his legitimate stock, you had Mary, that went on to become Bloody Mary. Mm-hmm. His son, who died by 14, he spent a fairly short time on the throne.
Yeah, and Edward the Sixth. Yeah, Edward the Sixth.
Right. Yep. And then Elizabeth I. So she carried on his Protestant legacy, as it were. Although Henry was more Anglo-Catholic, Elizabeth was more towards the pure Protestant line, I think.
Right. And she was known as the Virgin Queen and had an aversion to marriage.
Not literally.
That's how she portrayed herself. But I suppose her aversion to marriage would have been the fact that her mum, Anne Boleyn, got her head cut off. So maybe that had something to do with it.
Possibly.
I liked Elsa Lancaster in this film. And I like the fact that they were married and worked together, her and Charles Laughton, all through their life, which I found really interesting. And originally, Alexander Korda, the director who had a Hungarian background and had moved over to the UK. We have a lot of European directors going over to either the UK or changing their name a little bit and then getting on with their
Going over
careers.
From Europe in the 1930s, what could have influenced them?
Yeah.
I don't know.
But he was actually looking for a suitable film project for Charles and for Elsa to star in together. And apparently he overheard a cabbie singing the music hall song, I'm Henry VIII I Am. Do you know how that goes?
I don't.
Henry VIII I Am. If you ever watched the film Ghost, Patrick Swayze's character sings it in that. That's how I know it. And that led to a discussion, and it went on from there. And then they just kind of developed the script. And originally it was supposed to be about Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves only, which I think a movie could still definitely be made about that.
You can tell that was the part the script writers gave their most heart to.
Yeah, that's right. That definitely, for sure, sort of more of the comical elements as well. And I was wondering why Catherine of Aragon was only sort of briefly mentioned. They said because she was a respectable lady and this and that, and he had a, I guess compared to some of the other wives, he had a relatively decent breakup with her. But having said that, I think they just weren't interested in writing for her character, so they just decided not to.
They probably also ran out of film.
Yeah, that's
that many wives.
Yeah, and look, it's the private lives of Henry VIII, so they weren't really concentrating too much on the break from Rome with the Catholicism and Church of England, and they just really focused on his private life, which I think was right for this film.
Yeah, and I think it was a nice historical detail with her execution, because I think it was that they actually had to bring in a special executioner who was an expert with a sword for her execution.
Oh, okay. Is that just because...
It might have been special treatment, but there was all sorts of ranking effect across Europe when you look at executions. Like, I believe, when they did the French Revolution, they introduced the guillotine because it was meant to be quite symbolic of the equality of capital punishment. It wasn't just execution by axe for nobles and hanging for commoners.
Oh, okay. Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, so if you were well born enough, they would import a special sword executioner for you. That's, as I recall. I'm a bit behind on my Wikipedia reading.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And that's a nice segue into our next film, which we will be discussing, which is Marie. We're going across the English Channel and going over to France for this one. So France via Hollywood, I guess you could say. Marie Antoinette, 1938, and it's an American historical drama film produced by MGM. And it was directed by W.S. Van Dyke, starring the beautiful Norma Shearer as Marie Antoinette. It was based upon a 1932 biography that was written by Stefan Zweig. And it was also the last film of a producer, Irving Thalberg, who was actually Norma Shearer's husband. So that was the last project he worked on before he died. So, yeah, this film takes a look at sketches, I suppose, a series of scenes out of Marie Antoinette's life, who was the very famous or infamous wife of Louis XVI.
Yeah, and it's kind of like the polar opposite of the previous film, because in Henry VIII we saw all the excesses of royal authority being taken to extravagant extremes, whereas Marie Antoinette had all the extremities of circumstance done against her, because in many ways she's always been portrayed as a frivolous spendthrift, but in many ways I kind of see her as a victim, because for most of her life, yes, of course, what else was she going to do except spend a lot on gambling?
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't really know, when you think of Marie Antoinette, you think of the high hair pieces and the opulent gowns and things. Also, you think of the French Revolution. They were the last monarchs, basically before the revolution took over. And also her famous line of "let 'em eat cake," which I believe she didn't actually say anyway. It was just always attributed to her.
Apparently that was a term that had been even coined decades before she was born. It's just one of those various bits of Victorian age storytelling that's appeared.
Yeah, now we have a wonderful cast in this film. Obviously Norma Shearer, Tyrone Power, John Barrymore playing King Louis XV, and then Robert Morley, who I loved playing Louis XVI. I don't know if Louis XVI was that camp and over the top, but
he was he certainly wasn't James Bond. He was he was quite a keen hunter, so I don't think he could have been quite as he was a big eater and a keen hunter, so I think he would have been kind of like a gridiron player, sort of heavy set at times, but still quite able to hold himself physically, so probably not quite as clumsy as he was portrayed.
Yes, and unfortunately they, the reality of Marie and her husband Louis, they sort of made the best of a bad situation. Again, it was an arranged sort of political marriage. Marie was originally from Austria, the Austrian royal family. Was that the Habsburg family?
Yes.
I was watching a film, a mini documentary thing on genetics and why it's not good to marry people in your own family, obviously for genetic reasons. And her family was a family that basically put themselves into extinction, went extinct because of all of their intermarrying, and everyone got sick. And
well, it's believed partially the haemophilia that ran within Queen Victoria and passed on to the Tsar's son might have been partially because of too much, even just distant cousins and stuff. Because when you're talking over decades and centuries, a small gene pool does shrink a bit.
Yeah, all of her family had a particular type of chin or jaw, but this geneticist was sort of saying that, there was just too many inherited illnesses. And while there are obviously people who are still related to them alive today, a lot of immediate members of that family died from all sorts of ailments, but it was because they were all too closely related. And a lot of people, I was speaking to someone from an ethnic background, and they marry a lot within their family, and they see that as maintaining the strength of the family, but in a way it doesn't at all.
That's kind of a logic they had in ancient Egypt, where quite often, not just distant cousins, but siblings, they'd be marrying off to each other.
Yeah, well, I was even looking at some historical data on Tutankhamun, not to stray too far away, but
just a couple thousand years here and there.
But he apparently had a cleft palate and a club foot, and when you see his golden mask and everything, you know that he's young, but you don't see him as being this sort of disfigured sort of person. But he was everyone was interrelated to each other, and that was the sort of the earliest evidence of how detrimental it is to marry so closely and create children within your family.
Yeah, well, it is one of those constant debates within looking at his treasures and remains. Not sure if he had as much of a club foot that he'd need a cane, because he actually was buried with a lot of decorative canes.
Yeah, so that's, that actually kind of makes sense. So Marie herself has come from this family, and she was married to... What were they going for in this film? It sort of seemed like Louis the 16th, he wasn't able to function as a husband sort of thing, or... So
he, Louis the 16th apparently, it's believed, had a condition where it was sort of, I don't know if it was if it would have been something like a foreskin that was too tight or something, but it was not comfortable for him to be aroused.
Right, okay.
I don't know, and it took a few years, that's one belief, we kind of have a bit of uncertainty because it's obviously something that would have been kept in quite private circles.
Yeah.
Add to that we are talking, to be fair to them, they were 14 and 16. I'd be actually interested to see a film that, because quite often films depict these two in at best in their early 20s, and I'd actually like to see a film where you actually have a 14 and 16-year-old, and people would sympathise, God, I'd be awkward in that situation too.
Yes, that's actually right. I suppose at that time, it's something perhaps you could do now, even if the actors were slightly older, but still older teenagers. They could play a 14 and 16-year-old. But I guess at the time, let's just make them in their early 20s. That'll do. Look, Robert Morley is... I saw him straight away and I thought, is he an interesting casting choice, or do I not know enough about Louis the 16th and he's right up that alley? Or what did you think of him as a casting choice in this film?
It was... It kind of matched more the stereotypical storytelling that had built up of Louis the 16th in the whole Victorian period, because quite often when we're dealing with people of that far back, very often you have a generation of myth making that evolves on top of them, and he was actually quite an intelligent individual. He liked to play with locks and everything, and in virtue to him, he was apparently one of the first... he was the first French king in 200 years to not have an official mistress.
Oh, what? Yeah, he did seem sort of well-meaning, I suppose you could say.
He was a very pious person as well, and it's actually interesting if you look into the French history, because in some ways he had sealed a bit of fate for himself early on, because a big problem constantly for the French crown was that their tax collection system was so inefficient that you only got a fraction of it actually reached the palace, and that meant that often a lot of poor people were taxed rather unfairly because the wealthy could get themselves out of full responsibility. And his predecessor, his grandfather, had spent a lot of his time working through the courts to sort of get it on the way to a more efficient system, and Louis XVI, trying to sort of be popular, gave a lot of the powers back.
Right,
and there was all this complication with gold standard to the banking and stuff, but that's for a lot of very thick chapters of histories on the French Revolution, which we couldn't fit in here.
Right.
But he was very much more intelligent than he was portrayed. Yes, he was by all means awkward. He wasn't exactly a charmer on the dance floor. And he was probably a bit indifferent to his wife. It was apparently when that diamond necklace affair that was featured in the film that they became a bit closer.
Yes.
What I did find about this film is it was obviously that those writing it were familiar with a lot of the French Revolution story, and someone like me who knows a fair bit of it could follow up with each of the little events they were referring to. But I think to someone who was uninitiated with that part of history, they'd have gotten very confused watching it.
Yeah, I would probably recommend to everybody at least read a little of something of Henry VIII and Marie Antoinette / Louis XVI, just so when things crop up in the film, again, a lot of artistic license used in both films, but the major sort of events, especially towards the end of their lives, and obviously in Marie Antoinette, they, not to spoil the ending, but they die. It's just good to have an understanding of the backdrop, especially with the French Revolution, what was their role in it, and it gives you an idea. These people, you see portraits of them and the portly, King Henry VIII and Marie Antoinette, but, with the coiffed hair and the large gowns and let them eat cake and all that sort of stuff, and Palace of Versailles, and, but they were actually real people that interacted with the population. They were either loved or hated by sections of society. They had a lot of, machinations around them with their advisors, and like Madame du Barry, for example, who was his father's mistress, and he tried to get rid of her. This is in Marie Antoinette, and she was often regarded as the most hated woman in France at one point.
Marie Antoinette, she always had it worked against her that she was Austrian, and quite often anti-foreign sentiments would tie into issues with her.
Yeah, definitely. So 2 films really interesting if you're a historical buff, or even if you're just sort of getting yourself into it or you want to learn more. 2 great, interesting films to watch. Norma Shearer, who we haven't really spoken a lot about, who was absolutely stunning and beautiful. She is a Canadian-American actress, and she sort of was born in Montreal and then made her way down to Hollywood. And she was married to the producer of the film, Irving Thalberg, and he unfortunately died, but she did have children with him. And she was, just looking through some of the catalogue of her career, she was such a great choice to play this role. Did you like her in this film, or is there somebody else you thought might have been, from the time who would have been better, or?
I did enjoy her performance. There was something unique about it that I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was very, you sort of needed to have, in many ways, you sort of sympathize with her portrayal as someone who you could sort of understand her, because Marie Antoinette was sort of out of touch with reality in that she was such a spendthrift, but that can apply to anybody of privilege, and that's even now. All the reasons that people hated her, you could apply to the Kardashians now.
Yeah, that's exactly. Well, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, but she did manage to create a good sympathetic portrayal.
Yeah, she did. And she was really known. She was an Academy Award winner for a film I haven't seen yet, The Divorcee, in 1930. That was in the pre-code era. And so she was around, Joan Crawford, Greta Garbo, Jean Harlow. She was one of MGM's top actresses at that time in the 1930s. But when the production code came in, and we've mentioned this before, this is when they sort of codified what could be seen on film, what couldn't, to sort of a lot more stricter standards. She couldn't do some of the more racy, fun stuff that she was doing and moved into more period dramas. And
apparently she'd also made a couple of critical choices on film, which they ended up not being larger hits, and I think they probably put her off doing work for much longer.
Yeah, so the production code, 1934, and then pretty much from there on, Marie Antoinette was made in 1938, but she was a very celebrated actress, and she really up there in the top echelon of classic Hollywood actresses.
Yeah, she didn't produce as many as some, which is probably why she's not probably as well known as the likes of Ingrid Bergman and stuff.
That's right. Yeah, I think after her husband, after Mr. Thalberg died, she didn't sort of just quit straight away, but she sort of went off and looked after her children. But she was involved with James Stewart, and then and also George Raft as well. So she had a few sort of scandalous. And she did retire in 1942. So she did retire quite young compared to some other people, like my beloved Ray Milland, who acted all through his life.
Yeah, the reality, though, probably was that for women performers, there was probably more of a time limit imposed on them. But certainly, it sounds like she was going by a definite choice.
Yeah, in 1960, her secretary stated, "Miss Shearer does not want any publicity. She doesn't talk to anyone, but I can tell you that she has refused many requests to appear in motion pictures and TV shows."
I always wonder about some of these actors and other prominent people that may not have been active for years or decades, and yet suddenly they have when they might die or something, and they have a spokesman or an agent or a PR, and I'm like, they still hire someone to do that stuff? Do they get that much correspondence that they need to hire someone?
Yeah, she did sort of live to a ripe old age. Let's see, when she passed away was 1983, so she definitely saw a heck of a lot of that century.
Yeah, definitely. Well, even Olivia de Havilland, I think she had a PR person that announced her death or something, but I'm like, could she have really had enough going on to keep somebody that busy? Yes, she went to the Oscars 5 or something years before and another public event, but I'm like, could someone have had that many letters to type in relation to it?
Yeah, it's actually funny. You see people like Kim Novak and stuff around, and you think, I'm sure people still contact them a lot, but they must have other business interests or something, and hence the reason they have an office. But yeah, it is interesting. It'd be interesting to sort of see what goes on behind the scenes. But those were our 2 films for this week, and I liked both of them. But really good to go in with some basic knowledge of Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI and King Henry VIII and his 6 wives, I would say.
Yeah, it's it's considering the type of person that influenced to do this episode, which was Prince Philip, who's sort of always been known for a very austere, no-nonsense type. These were kind of the 2 other polar opposites of what it is to be royalty, because even though Philip wasn't born into it, he was born into it, but he could have basically lived a fairly normal middle-class life if he hadn't married Elizabeth.
Yeah. But he was the right choice for her. They stuck together all those years, and she was obviously from a much different era where she wouldn't have got divorced anyway. But
so, yes, we went for the royal theme out of influence of his recent passing, but these were quite 2. These kind of show the various extremes of personality that go into their kind of life.
Yeah, definitely. So that's it for this week. For our next exciting episode of When Movies Were Good, we're going with more a ghostly tone. Not that Rex Harrison is a ghost, of course, but, we're going to be doing 2 Rex Harrison films. Matt suggested this, and I thought it would be fun. We're doing Blythe Spirit, which is one of Noel Coward's plays, 1945, and then The Ghost of Mrs. Muir, which has had several different incarnations after this 1947 film, which he made with Gene Tierney. So I think that'll be good.
Yeah, Rex Harrison certainly thought he was a king, or should
Yeah.
be. Yeah, I was fascinated with his work for years because I loved him in My Fair Lady.
Yeah.
I did find out years afterwards, though, that he was apparently a real jerk in real life.
Yeah. I remember Matt and I were in the cinema once, and some actor who's not important who it was, he came on, and Matt said, "Oh, would you go and see that film?" I said, "No, I don't like that actor. He's a real pain in the butt and he's rude and everything." And then you said, "Yeah, have you seen The Ghost of Mrs. Muir?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, I have, or I've seen parts of it." And you said, "Well, Rex Harrison was a real pain in the ass." Although we always found out with these people many years after that they were, but now because of social media, you find out in real time.
Exactly. You had to be on your guard a lot more. He was an absolutely excellent actor, and that is why we are doing that episode. But yes, we're not saying anything other than he was an actual real jerk off in his personal life. But we'll get more into detail in that in the episode.
We will, and that wraps it all up. So as Matt always tells you at the end of the episode, you can find us on
any social media platform you like.
Yeah.
Including Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook.
And in the meantime, I'm Rachel.
I'm Matthew.
And we're watching good movies. Thank you and good night.